This is Pastoring in the Digital Parish, your resource and point of connection for building digital ministry strategy and bringing your congregation into the digital age. My name is Ryan Dunn. I'm a digital communicator, church volunteer, ordained clergy person, host of this here podcast, and a future of church enthusiast. We're wrapping up another season of Pastoring in the Digital Parish. This is the capstone of season 5 already. Formerly, I'd use these capstone episodes to sum up some of the things that I'd learned through the previous season, but starting last season, I started using this final episode to square up some unfinished business and sum up some of the recent learnings by providing some ideas of where we're heading instead of, fully looking back. I'm still gonna roll in that lane with this final episode for season 5. Specifically, I'm gonna keep rolling with the idea that digital is here to stay. For now, at least. The church has always been shaped, in part, by the culture around it. Always. So that means that by virtue of the society in which those of us listening to this podcast live, that church will continue to engage with and occupy digital spaces. Simply because that is what our society does and will continue to do until, I guess, it simply doesn't anymore. Whether that means it moved on to something else or that the digital is no longer largely available. Apocalyptic type stuff. I don't know. Now, I realize it's a little edgy to say that church has always been shaped by culture. So let me clarify that statement just a little bit. The nature of the church has not changed all that much. The church in the beginning was called to be the collective of disciples of Jesus and enact Christ's presence in the world. That has not changed. And that has not changed by culture. But the practices of the church have definitely changed according to the culture around us. A lot of the social media work that I do is under accounts branded as Rethink Church. Now, every now and then, someone takes exception to that name, claiming that we don't need to rethink the church. I've often had to clarify that the phrase is intended to be invitational and not necessarily critical. Like, we're not calling the church to rethink itself. We're inviting those outside of the church to consider what church is. Anyways, one of the naysayers recently commented on a post by saying something like, "Rethink church? ? No thanks. I'll stick with my church where we worship just as Jesus taught us 2,000 years ago." Now, that inspires some creative interpretation. What do you imagine that looks like? I was really caught up in wondering if there is a church in the U.S. that actually worships in a way that would have felt remotely familiar to Jesus. You know what I mean? If first century Jesus decided to join one of our Sunday morning worship gatherings, would he have any idea what was going on? Even if language wasn't a factor? I think probably not. According to my church history courses, Christian worship, no matter the context, has changed quite a bit over the centuries. For example, the Christians of the 2nd century were a largely persecuted people. They wouldn't have had any dedicated meeting spaces or buildings. I doubt that they had many large group gatherings on the scale that most of us here in the West long for. 200 people was far too much attention, right? Choirs and praise musicians wouldn't have been a regular practice. There wasn't even a canonized Bible, so what did sermonizing look like or contain? It was probably much more testimonial or experientially based, right? We think the Eucharist was still an important part of their gatherings, but did their Eucharist look like our Eucharist or communion? Chances are slim that it did, right? We know from the writings of people like Cyril of Jerusalem and the nun Egeria that worship in the 4th century Jerusalem looked like. We know what that looked like. A lot of us would probably note the length. These Christians did not practice the 1-hour rule. Worship was often a most of the day affair. On special days, they had 2-a-days, taking a bit of a break in the middle. And pilgrimage was a large part of their worship gatherings. So their worship moved from sacred locale to sacred locale. Worship here was tied to the tangible place. For congregations where the setting was not quite as sacred as Jerusalem, the tangible was still important. They relied on things like holy relics and iconography in their worship services. And these were practices that were vital according to their cultural context, but would feel strange for our context today. But at the time, they may have very well been saying to one another, hey, if we cease using these artifacts or these icons, then we'll cease being who we are as a community. Now, we fast forward to the 21st century, Nashville or Springfield or wherever, and it's easy to see that though these cultural practices have changed, the community of church has not ceased to be. However, we experience the same kind of debate that the early Christian practitioners may have experienced today, do we not? We feel the anxiety of this argument when we consider the evolving way in which church gathers. This fear is summed up today by saying, if we embrace the digital practice, then we'll lose who we are. The argument might go on to say that we are an embodied people, and by meeting digitally, we lose the embodiment, and thereby we lose who we are. I'm not going to make a theological argument either for or against that kind of statement in this particular episode, although I will lift up that we have heard that argument probably most explicitly in our season 1 episode with Will Ranney. I am going to make, however, an ecclesiological argument. And that argument stems out of the evidence that I see suggesting that church practice has always been fluid and has always been reactive to cultural change. And those changes have not ultimately destroyed the nature of the church. We've heard from the likes of Andrew Root and Jeffrey Mahon through this podcast. If you haven't listened to their episodes, it'll be worth it to go back to when you do have the time. And they've made cases in support of seeing the church as a series of contextual experiments. I love that idea because somewhere along the way, we lost the experimental value of being church. Somehow we began to put more weight into the voice of the past that says we've always done it this way, and discredited the voice that suggests there's something new yet to discover. But looking historically, we see that the church has always been in a mode of adaptation and innovation. And this innovation is often driven by a seismic cultural change, which we are experiencing today, of course, thanks to the digital revolution and the changing ways in which people interact with one another. But history has more to say to us here, as we are not the first generation of the church to experience seismic cultural change, nor are we the first generation to face declining participation numbers. During the early colonial period in America, church simply wasn't accessible and therefore not well engaged for much of the population. If you think a bit creatively about the situation, it's not that different from ours today. Today, we have, in a sense, an increasingly remote population. Now, we're separated spatially, in a sense, by our reliance on technology, meaning that, we live near each other, but we're not always together in community as much. The response may not be all that dissimilar to what it was then in the early colonial period, to put the church where the people are. In our Methodist system, this system was embodied in church circuit riders. These were specially ordained individuals who traveled to remote places to preach and to organize the church. And these circuit riders used the technology of the day, in most cases that was horseback, to meet the people where they were. And historically, the church at large has actually been good at embracing new technologies to continue to meet people where they were. But, of course, not without the same reservations that we hear about and that many hold today. Did you know that when radio was becoming widespread, there was resistance to broadcasting services on the airwaves? The thought is a familiar one to many of us. People would say, if we broadcast services to people's homes, they'll stop attending church in person. That obviously didn't happen. The American church hit its climactic point of involvement well after the introduction of radio and the inclusion of worship services and radio broadcasts. And the same reservations were expressed when television became widespread, and some suggested broadcasting worship services there as well. They heard the same objection. I wonder if these reservations were expressed in even earlier times as well. Were we afraid that preachers would fall by the wayside when the printing press and translations and education made Bibles accessible to a greater number of people? I don't know. Here's what we can learn through this historical snapshot, however. At least here's where I kind of land on this. Accessibility and replacement are two quite different things. And when we talk about digital ministry or digital church, we're not talking about replacement. Instead, we're talking about accessibility. So let's talk for a moment about what accessibility looks like in today's environment. We are in a culture of on demand. I can get nearly whatever media entertainment I want, whenever I want, and really wherever I want. Product orders that once took 4 to 6 weeks now take 3 to 5 business days, sometimes even 24 hours if you're, a super Amazon person. I work a full-time job in my home, and yet I'm still instantly connected to my company of over 70 people. In this environment, accessibility is bound by neither time nor place. Remember, if I want to watch the latest Avengers movie while waiting for a ringback from my virtual doctor's appointment, I can do that. Accessibility for the church means opening up the presence of the church in a way that's not so much bound by specific time and specific place. And this is why digital is here to stay for now, because digital presence allows us to use the accessibility that we have available to us to be the church alongside people in an on-demand society. And I think that is more exciting than it is scary. And it's especially exciting when we consider that the church in the United States has been in decline in terms of involvement since well before this period of normalization for streaming worship. I mean, that's not exciting that the church is in decline. What's exciting is that we see an avenue for the church to claim a historical tradition of moving to where people are in order to invite them into the activity of discipleship. And we've witnessed all of that through the stories that we've shared this past season. We heard about how Oikon Church leveraged digital presence to become an embodied congregation, right? They started in the digital space and then moved to an embodied congregation. We heard how Birmingham First UMC leveraged TikTok to grow their congregation. And Bosarge and the Chapel Online used weekly prayer streams to build connections worldwide. And we heard about New Wineskins and their story that community provided connection for spiritual wanderers. There are so many more stories to share. And so that means that we'll be back with another season of pastoring in the Digital Parish in May of 2023. I've already got some episodes set. We're going to participate in virtual reality church in the metaverse. That will be one episode. We're going to do a crossover gaming stream. We're going to share the story of a congregation that's being built online for spiritual nomads. All right, that's going to put a wrap on this season number 5 already of pastoring in the Digital Parish. I just gave you a bunch of episodes to follow up this one. Or, if you haven't already, go back to season 1 and collect some of the history. And then leave a rating and or review, please, and thank you. Again, I'm Ryan Dunn. I'd like to thank resourceumc.org, the online destination for leaders throughout the United Methodist Church. They make this podcast possible. And of course, they host our website, pastoringinthedigitalparish.com, where you can find more online resources for ministry. If you want to connect, check out our Pastoring in the Digital Parish group on Facebook. You can also send me questions and ideas for future sessions. It's a great time to do that since we're starting to build the schedule for season 6. You can do that at the email address digitalparish@umcom.org. I would say another session comes next week, but we'll be back in May 20 of 23 with season 6. In the meantime, peace.